Hello, friends. I'm Benga. I discuss international law, international politics, and international relations. There has been another coup in Gabon. Gabon, an African state in the Central African region, doesn't belong to ECOWAS this time, has experienced a coup less than 24 hours ago. Gabon now has a new military ruler, styled interim leader. His name is Brice Oligui Nguema. Gabon's ex-president, we have to use that term now, Ali Bongo, who just won an election a few days ago, Wednesday night, announced, has suffered a dramatic removal and reversal of fortunes from the early hours of yesterday, less than 24 hours, as I said. He was declared leader not too long ago, but now he's gone. Nguema, who is his cousin, now heads the Gabonese presidency. He was, up until that moment when he decided to do the unthinkable, the head of the Gabonese presidency Republican Guard, the country's most powerful security unit. This was precisely what I have been saying in my last trilogy of videos on this topic, specifically dealing with the very recent coup in Niger. I predicted, and I was certain about that prediction, that there were going to be many coups coming after the Niger coup. I will have to come up with a lot of African proverbs to cover this situation. Permit me that luxury. There is an African proverb that we have not left the divination bowl and the prophecies have started coming true. I said of Niger that if the problem in Niger is not resolved against the coup plotters there, there's going to be a contagion of coups. I predicted that there will be 5 coups in less than 10 years. One has happened in less than a month from my prediction. So here we go. Nguema is actually Ali Bongo's cousin, a cousin of the former president of Gabon. He headed the Gabonese presidency's Republican Guard, and that was the country's most powerful security unit. Well, now he heads the country. Yes, we know that Gabonese elections have always been fractious. They've always been a very interesting affair, to say the least. There have also been coup scares in the past. Yes, we know that the Gabonese presidency has remained in one family for far too long. Since 1967, the president of Gabon has always had the same surname, Bongo. Father died around 2007, 2009, and his son has taken over. But for all we know, given the many colors that democracy has across the world, it's a democratic country, given the wide definition that that term can have. It's no longer a democratic country today. It is family in the military corner. It's family in the dictatorship corner. And the new leader, Brice Oligui Nguema, has placed his master, the man he was paid to look after, under house arrest. Again, France is in the picture. No doubt France has been central to the maintenance of the existence of the Bongo family. This is the French method across West Africa, across the French-speaking Africa, granting their puppets, their dictators, a long lease of life. And of course, the French state making benefits from all that. The thing to know, though, is that half-breed may be much better than none. A democracy that is flawed is in many ways much better than none. The Bongo family, at least in recent times, have had to face elections. They've had to appeal to the population. They've had to do what most democracies have to do, which is to offer a reasonably good service in order to be able to face an election. The Bongo family, the Ali Bongo, won the election. It may be flawed. I agree entirely about that. But this coup is the 8th coup in Africa. The 8th coup in Africa, and it brings Africa to a dangerous tipping point in dictatorship as the order of the day. 8 out of 54 African states, depends on how you count. Maybe if you have to put Western Sahara, some plus or minus, some of the states that are still fighting recognition. We have between 54 and 57 African states. I will stick with 54. We now have 14.815 of that 54 countries under military rule. And I insist on being pedantic here by saying it's 14.815 because it's definitely mathematically more than 14%. If you have a 10% chance of catching a disease, you would be really worried. By the time you have a 14% chance of catching that disease or suffering from an ailment, whatever it is, you are not in a good place. Therefore, I make bold to say that Africa is not in a good place. I make bold to say that what has happened to Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Chad, and continues to spread is going to erase all the gains we've made in Africa since the 1990s. And the effects of that, contrary to the expectation of people that it will lead to benefits and good things, is going to be that it will put Africa in a very tight economic situation. What happens to a fellow African country happens to all African countries because economies are intertwined even beyond what our studies show. Your neighbors are the places where you sell your goods to the most. They buy most of your goods. Informal economy is very high in Africa. If your neighbor is sinking due to bad governance, bad rule of law, which always gets worse, both gets worse under military rule, then of course, it will affect the countries in the region. We all know what happened to Libya and how it had reverberations down all the way to Nigeria in security worsening, with Boko Haram having access to the guns they should not have and military hardware they should not have. So it's not good news. African countries will attract less, not as if they are doing very well in foreign direct investments, but good businesses don't go to militarily ruled countries. The cowboy businesses go there. You find, even in the extractive sector, the high risk takers, because that's the way a country that's under dictatorship is seen. They'll be seen as high risk, and all the regular blue chip companies will stay away or have just a minimal investment there. And then all the kinds of businesses that will show up there will be exactly the same types who deal with military governments, who know the language of bribery, and who would pay heavily for even heavier profits to have things done in Africa. We saw that happen with Mark Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher's son, and his friends who finished from Eaton, who took over or tried to take over, the Equatorial Guinea in a coup. Those are the type of people who will show up in business in Africa when you have the terrible situation of having military governments in power. Again, I'm sure and I know that there's no shortage of people who think anything is better than the Bongo family and that it's good, it must be good that there has been a change. I say to that, not yet uhuru. Nguema, the new interim leader, is actually a member of the Bongo family. He is a cousin of Ali Bongo. He is one of the most influential and enigmatic figures in his country. He was a son, or he is a son of a military ruler, military personnel himself, military officer. He trained in Morocco at the Royal Academy of Meknes. Nguema was an aide-de-camp in the services of the Bongo family dating back to 2009 when the father Bongo was still alive. So what I make bold to submit here is that it's not yet uhuru. What we are seeing in Gabon, what we have today, what we will have tomorrow, compared to what we had yesterday when a Bongo was in power, is the difference between 6 and half a dozen. As you well recognize, there's no difference between give me 6 things and give me half a dozen things. This military man has always been close to the power base of Gabon. He is literally a member of the family, blood ties. He is not a man of his words. And this is the thing I said about the previous coups. I remember specifically saying this, that a lot, I don't want to say every, maybe even every presidential guard team in Africa right now are winking at each other and wondering whether they can pull this out, whether they can do the same thing. And we've seen it happen in Gabon. These men are not men of their words. They can't do the one job they are given, which is to keep the president safe. Such people cannot be trusted with power. They are not men of their words. Nguema even composed a song to his principal along the lines that I would defend my president with honor and loyalty. This is the type of characters we are talking about. They would go as much as to compose a song and then do the exact opposite of what they said, what they are paid to do. Bryce Olugwe Nguema is not to be trusted. Bryce Olungo Nguema is actually, apart from not being a man of his words, is also a millionaire and a businessman. So one of the reasons why he's not even a good soldier is because he's always been involved in dodgy businesses. He is known as a millionaire in Gabon. From the little research I've done in the little time we've had, he is entrepreneurial rather than soldiering in character. Worse than that, he is corrupt to the core. And I say that on authority. According to a 2020 investigation by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the shortened abbreviation for them is known as the OCCRP. Very well known, they do fantastic work, very influential. They looked into the Bongo family's assets, and Nguema featured in it because it's part of the family. He is so featured in it that it was specifically alleged that he bought 3 properties in middle and working class neighborhoods in the Maryland suburbs of Silver Spring in the US between 2015 and 2018. 3 properties. Many of us will be lucky to ever have 3 cars at the same time in our life. This man has 3 properties in the US. It's not the only set of properties he has. The homes were purchased with a total of over 1 million in cash. When he was confronted with these facts, his only response was to say that he thinks this is a private affair, that no matter where you live in the world, you have a right to your privacy to be respected. That's the man a lot of have had this, because I hear it all the time. There are people who, they are lazy thinkers among the African elites. The African elite system has a problem. They should be thinking for the majority of Africans, but particularly a strand of African elites are just as lazy as the common man on the streets when they react to things like this in their thinking and in their ability to problematize situation and come up with reasonable diagnosis. They do think that characters like this are just good news because there is a change. We've been having bad problems with African leaders. We're having tight African leaders. Therefore, it seems they think anything that comes next is good enough. I dare to be different on this. So we need to stem this contagion. It's something that needs to be stopped. It's the very reason why from the very beginning, I supported President of Nigeria, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, in his plan to take over Niger by force if need be, along with the ECOWAS. They've said they would do this if these negotiations fail. I think this coup gives even more kudos to Bola Ahmed Tinubu. I've always known him to be a man who thinks ahead, who sees what's coming next. That's why a lot of people take it that he's been planning for his presidency, which he just won earlier on this year, by planning ahead 20 years. That's the kind of character that we need. Someone who can see what's coming next 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead. He was so moved by that Niger coup that he knew something had to be done. And I hope he will go ahead to do this. If we can't solve Africa's problems, we can at least solve ECOWAS problems, because that's the one that affects our economy. We have all kinds of treaties binding us with our ECOWAS neighbors, including immigration, including, as we will come to see very soon, maybe having the same currency with them. So therefore, we cannot. We have to stem the contagion of coups in Africa. We know that coups still happen. They are not gone. There was a brief period just between 20 years ago and 10 years ago when we thought we've reached the end of history. Well, no, we have not reached the end of history. History tends to repeat itself. We are slipping back into the terrible period of coups. I remember when the attempted coup in Turkey took place, I wrote a piece in the Conversation. The Conversation is one of the emergent, real, well-read, well-respected journals in the UK. There's an African version as well. It's in the West here, and there's an African version of the Conversation. I wrote an article titled, I think, "Can you still pull a coup these days?" That's the exact title. Can you still pull a coup these days? And I noted there in that article that although the Turkish coup had failed, and that it was a good thing that it had failed, there's still the risk of contagion in coup plotting and coup making. When I wrote that in 2016, it looked a bit like it's not going to really happen. How could we slip back into coup making? Well, we have. Since then, there has been an attempted coup in the United States of America. That happened 6 January 2021, when certain forces thought they could storm the Capitol and take over the country. That was their stated intention. In Germany, on 7th December 2022, 25 people, doesn't matter the number. When they succeed, the numbers increase. Tried to take over the German government. Coups have been attempted in Burundi. They've succeeded in Zimbabwe. It's happened in 4 different countries within 3 years. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. We are back at that terrible thing that should not happen. So what needs to be done? I have 2 sets of ideas about what needs to be done. The first sets are the short term, and I will limit it at first to what needs to be done about Gabon. It extends to what needs to be done about Niger. It extends to what needs to be done about some of the older coups. But for Gabon, let's say the first thing to do is to deny that government recognition. Governments that are irregular, that come in by coups, should be denied recognition. It's a good start that we've had the right noises from the EU and the African Union. The EU has condemned the coup. The African Union has condemned the coup. Russia has condemned the coup. They said the coup in Gabon is anti-France, but not pro-Russia. So let's get that straight, because we have a lot of lazy thinkers who are out there celebrating that this is good for Russia. This must be good for... There are people who live in this la-la world when they don't recognize dangers. I guess they are not trained to recognize certain type of dangers. I wouldn't know when a dangerous strain of virus is spreading. I won't know its name, and I won't know how it can replicate itself. I won't know the dangers, but I will follow the advice of those who know. Similarly, a lot of people are not aware of these dangers, governmental dangers, rule of law dangers, dangers to international law, dangers to international relations that is represented by coup plotting and coup making. So they have to be denied recognition. That's the first thing. We have to recognize that people who hold nations to hostage should not be respected. We should dare to call them treasoners. We should dare to treat them as perpetrators of treason. No one is allowed to run reckless and steal countries. If we found someone trying to steal a car, we would shout thief, we would call the police. If we find people trying or haven't recently stolen a country, we should also stop them from escaping with their crimes. I remember clearly that when there was a coup in Spain in 1981, I was a young person then. I followed it tangentially because I've always been interested in these matters. But I got to learn that that coup in Spain failed principally because the king of Spain, who the coup plotters thought they were protecting and trying to perpetuate his rulership, is named the king of Spain, is known as Juan Carlos. The king of Spain came out and said, "You are not doing this in my name." He announced that they have to immediately go back and resign on their steps. These soldiers who had entered the Spanish parliament, their leader even shot guns into the ceilings of the parliament, knew that they were not going to get the backing of King Juan Carlos. Their coup failed. This is the kind of standing for truth, seeing through the fog of nonsense that I expect of leaders, that I expect of thinkers, that I expect of anyone really who has been through higher education. The Supreme Commander on that occasion failed. So also did it fail in Turkey. The British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, called them terrorists. And that's what they are. When people commit coups, they do a lot of things that are wrong all at the same time. They kidnap, they assault, they commit battery, they kill. Even the failed coup in Turkey, 200 people died. So these are grave crimes. These people are not champions of anyone. Other things that need to be done is that other independent governments need to take a stance against this present government. Apart from denying them recognition, they need to take a strong stance, and that strong stance needs to be orchestrated. For instance, all Gabon's government assets should be seized. Any loans applied for by them should be denied. They should not be allowed any loans. All sovereign credits of Gabon should be frozen. There should be a natural response to tell the guards who have taken over a supermarket that they are not allowed to take a loan on that supermarket. If you have been a bank guard, your guard security department to look after a bank, you should not be able to take over that bank and then receive loans on behalf of that bank. You should not be able to mortgage the store that you could not protect. I think also that those countries that, and those people who think that they may get some geopolitical advantage out of this should think long-term. They should think long-term and realize that this is bad for them on the whole. An Africa that is strong, an Africa that has strong traditions in democracy is good for all. If African countries are rich, then there will be more people to buy goods from Russia, from France, from Britain, from wherever. But if African countries are poor, then the number of Africans that can buy these luxury goods will, of course, be less. So there is something in it for everyone, including the fact that coup plotting and rule of law breaking will lead to more people crossing the deserts, walking across the desert, climbing over wires to sneak into Europe. That certainly cannot be good for all. What else do I want seen done? I want it to be done that nobody gives any money to these guys. Nobody deals with them. We need to protect democracy. In terms of long-term measures, again, we need to stem this contagion. We need to prescribe deterrence. I like the classical theory on deterrence. It applies to criminology, it applies to criminal law, as it applies also to international relations. For instance, the theory of deterrence is the one that makes some countries insist on having the nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons are a deterrence. We need a nuclear weapon option of non-recognition and total destruction of the governments that take governments by force in Africa, as in everywhere else. So the deterrence theory is one which I like a lot. It holds that you have to punish excessively, and punishment needs to be swift, it needs to be severe, it needs to be certain, and it must have celerity. The deterrence theory is the theory of Jeremy Bentham. It's also the theory of an Italian scholar. His name has just left my head now. They jointly came up to this theory of deterrence. And I think the deterrence theory needs to apply to the possibility of coup plotting in Africa. This is the reason why President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and the ECOWAS, all those good countries in the ECOWAS, lots of them, Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, they should be supported in making sure that the nonsense, the arrant nonsense that has happened in Niger does not stand. They don't need 3 years to move back to democracy. They don't need 6 months to move back to democracy. They need to return the country to democracy now. I'm not saying they have to return it to the last person who was removed, but they need to return it to democracy now. That country deserves it. Africa deserves it. Coups are bad. They are organized crime. And I'll recommend another reading on this. I'll recommend that you find, if possible, the readings of Charles Samford. Charles Samford is, if I remember, the last I followed him was a director of an institute for ethics and governance and law. He wrote extensively on the evils of coup plotting and coup making across the world. And he was right in his conclusion that coups are a form of organized crime. Coups involved so many acts of serious criminality, from trespass to kidnapping to thefts of government assets, corporate and real. A special condemnation is reserved for those whose crime involved doing the very opposite of what they are paid to do. If we condemn doctors who kill their patients in England, just in the last week, within the last week, a certain nurse who has been killing babies, she works in the pediatric section, and she engages in some psychological problems, whatever it is she has. God knows what name one can call such a thing. It's so evil. I can't come up with names that will fit it here. She's been killing twins. She's been killing babies less than 6 months old while being paid to do the exact opposite. Well, she was discovered and she has been sentenced to life imprisonment, and life will mean life on this one, I promise you. If we can do that to that nurse, if we can make sure that those who abuse children as teachers in their schools, if we can hold lawyers who pervert justice to account, then we should hold soldiers who pervert their main role to account. We should do the same thing to coup leaders. It is the duty of the military to protect the state and its people from external threats. That is why we give them deadly weapons. That is why we recognize and give them command. They are not supermen by nature. It's an agreement of society, an agreement of their principle that they should be empowered to keep the society safe. It's not for them to turn it into an opportunity to acquire money and prestige. If they use that power against the state, then it is right that those of us who are right thinking make sure that they face the obloquy that they deserve to face. We are supposed to give them trouble. It's not supposed to be easy for them. Coups are organized crimes. They consist of attempts to entrench corruption. In the case of Gabon, This starts with the continuation of the fact that the person who has made this coup possible is going to receive salaries at the end of this month. He should not. He has, like with those who engage in the coup with him, broken the very contract that he signed with the states. Some would say, but their sovereignty and countries and states should have the right to, they even try to style this as a self-determination issue, that we should leave such countries to determine their future. That's not right. That's not how to think. I said in my article, Can You Pull Off Coup d'etat These Days, in 2016, that in this era that we live in, states no longer enjoy unrestricted sovereignty over what happens in their territorial confines. It is generally acceptable for a democratic government to have elected officers and to have an expectation that those elected officers will not be removed until the next election. And it is therefore the role of the United Nations, the role of international governmental organizations, international NGOs like Amnesty, the Red Cross, Greenpeace, Human Rights Watch, to spy and pry into the affairs of any country, really, even imperfect democracies, and certainly countries that have decided to go dictatorial. The ability to dissent from this is restricted for states. You are going to be challenged from within and from outside. Perhaps I have a bit of a disclosure to make here. One of the reasons why I'm quite strong on this, I've said it, I've made about 3 videos on this already, is that in my previous professional life, I was a human rights lawyer. That's where I started my professional life. And as a human rights lawyer in a militarily ruled Nigeria in the 1990s, it was a big battle. I have friends who lost their lives to military governments while trying to fight to get them out of government. The torture that goes on in military eras is unimaginable. People would soon learn. They are intransigents, the way you can't remove them. I'll give you an example. There was a time in Nigeria. Nigeria is not even known to have the worst military governments, at least in terms of human rights abuse, but certainly in terms of corruption. They are well known for that. There was a time you cannot enter a government building if you didn't have a small brooch on your chest, whatever you're wearing, which contained the face of the then Nigerian dictator, Ibrahim Abacha, now dead. It was that bad. Taxi drivers, anyone who had anything to do with the government, had to have stickers of his face on their car. That's what the military governments will turn to. By design, you can expect it, and it will happen. So we have to resist them. Democratic governance is increasingly seen as the only way to do governance across the world. We are not saying they are perfect. We've not reached the end of history. We don't have a particular type of democratic governance that has been vetted by all, but it's a nice place to start from. A military junta will face increasing and unrelenting pressure from within and outside the states. And you know what? A military government will face increasing and unrelenting pressure from within the military itself. This is why there will be coups and counter coups and counter coups and phantom coups and intrigues to no end and secret killings, assassination squads, killing of people in phantom coups just to remove them. It's going to be messy. It always is in military regimes. So long-term solutions means we have to use the deterrence over them. There is an expectation that the growth of democracy should continue, that almost half of the world's countries are now democratic, and that should continue going forward rather than we increasing the percentage of African countries that are going back into the past. In conclusion, we should know that there is a huge battle ahead for the soul of Africa. Those who are happy that France is getting a bloody nose should know, and I've said this before, quite proud of my predictions, that France and the Western world will not disappear from Africa. What they are likely to do is to sponsor their own coups, and they are the best at this. Russia has nothing on them. Russia has no real history in this area. So if you support coups, you will have coups, and they will belong to the same people you think you are spiting with coups. The leader of the current Gabonese junta is actually trained in the US. There's a lot of talk about the fact that the CIA has been breeding him and training him to take over from Ali Bongo in any case. So watch this space. We don't even know where he's going in his policies. There's a strand of expectation that this might even be the US saying France is not good at doing things again. We have to take control. Don't quote me on that. It's just a strand of thinking, as I said. But we are watching. The real danger, I think, is the intellectual laziness in the African elite class. And I'll keep repeating that. Those who should be thinking for Africa are not thinking for Africa. They are thinking like the common man on the street. They are thinking like WhatsApp group electronic tigers. They are not thinking with their full professional selves, advising themselves with their dozens of years of training, formal and inexperience. Military coups will not give good governance. If you are complaining that African countries are not being ruled well, military are no better, at the very least. In fact, they are worse. Military governments don't hold elections. If you are complaining about the quality of elections in Africa, that happens for 4 years, every 4 years, and if you are complaining about that, just realize that after 4 years, you have no hope of getting the military government out. They would stay until the next best shot gets them out. I predicted that there will be more coups. It started happening. More countries will roll. We have to stop this. Thank you for listening, and let's watch this space.